Many of you will know the work we're doing in the City of Newcastle, and I thought it was really important to talk about our climate action plan that we have adopted at the City, as well as our more recent environmental strategy. Everyone knows we're experiencing rapid energy transformation in the Hunter region, and our climate action plan and environment strategy outlines our really important role in this transition and our commitment at the City of Newcastle to strong action on climate change. So this climate action plan outlines our plan citywide to reach net zero emissions by 2030 and the really important role that the city will play in transitioning everyone by 2040 in the City of Newcastle, which is a really, really ambitious target. As many people would know, we have committed formally to the goals of the Paris Agreement, declared a climate emergency, and we're also founding members of the City of ICLEI, which is Local Governments for Sustainability, and through that network I also chair the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy across the Oceania region here. In 2019, the City of Newcastle was the first local government in New South Wales to utilise 100% renewable energy for our operations, and that also included the installation of a 5 megawatt solar farm, and importantly, to get there, a renewable energy power purchase agreement with a 270 megawatt Sapphire wind farm in the New England region of New South Wales. At the same time, we've been doing a lot of heavy lifting inside our own operations at Council, as many of you would know over the last a few years. We've installed 818 kilowatts of solar and 326 kilowatt hours of battery storage across 13 sites in the city, and we're generating 1 gigawatt hours of renewable energy, which is fantastic. So between 2020 and 2022, we've also converted 13,400 of our street lights across the city to LEDs, which has been part of our climate action plan. As many people would also know, we own and operate 16 electric vehicle charging points across 4 locations in the city, powered by renewable energy. We've also taken great strides in electrifying our own fleet, plant and equipment, including electric passenger vehicles, light fleet and electric bikes. We're also soon to embark on a 12-month trial of a new hydrogen fuel cell electric truck for waste collection, which is obviously a really big and important area for local government to transition if we are electrifying our fleet. Look, as many of you would know, we've been Novocastrians for a long time, like myself. You would know that we have successfully navigated previous economic transitions in Newcastle. And we have a plan at the city to position ourselves to take full advantage of a low carbon economy and also the city's transition to net zero. We can promote low emissions technologies, large scale renewable energy sources like offshore wind, which is coming to Newcastle, which is fantastic, green hydrogen and ammonia export hubs, and green metal and minerals processing. And by becoming an international leader in renewable energy and associated industries, this transition will show that significant capital investment will translate into really, really importantly, adaptation of local jobs, skills and infrastructure and services. We have a huge and fast transition already upon us here in Newcastle and the Hunter region, and obviously right across the world, but Australia-wide. But we have the skills in this region to really harness what we can do in providing the powerhouse of renewable energy for this country. Our environment strategy, which was endorsed by the elected council in October last year, provides a roadmap for achieving that sustainability, not just in our energy transition, but in all facets of sustainability over the next 10 years. So I just wanted to remind everyone as we start this process of empowering Newcastle and really trying to work with everyone in the community to transition to net zero by 2040. Our environment strategy does lay out this plan over the next 10 years, and it focuses on partnering with traditional custodians on the way we care for and manage land, a number of those points there show how we'll continue our investment in solar PV and battery storage. It'll show how we do the future electrification of our vehicles, plant and equipment, and also that citywide transition to low emissions transport. It shows how we respond to our climate risks through our coastal flood risk and bushfire management programs. It expands our urban forest and biodiversity corridors. It looks at how we can create that blue-green grid and that links active transport networks across the city. There's also a really important renewed focus on sustainable procurement, particularly for construction activities and operations. And again, it positions us to take that full advantage of our transition to a low carbon economy and the city's transition to net zero. Just through this environment strategy that we adopted last year, we're already seeing the investment of $1.7 million into 32 new electric EV charging ports across 11 locations. And just note that there's a significant $3 million funding to be able to do that from the New South Wales government, which is really important to have all levels of government working towards this low carbon economy. It has been really significant in the last 2 years, 12 months, to be able to work with state and federal governments to these goals, and been very, very difficult before that. We will then have 48 new EV charging ports across 15 locations. Importantly, this also works on energy transitions at civic buildings, like the one we're in today, City Hall across the road at the Civic Theatre, again the museum, as well as Beresford Childcare Centre. We're working now on upgrading the energy there. Importantly, a vital component of our environment strategy is the delivery of community and business programs offering energy efficiency, accessible renewable energy, and electrification. And that is why we are here tonight. So that brings me to our Empowering Newcastle event series, and that is the program we are launching tonight with Saul, which is really, really exciting for the city. And I can't think of a better person straight off a plane from the US to join us here, the best place to be in Australia, as we explore how we can have our own local action plan to electrify Newcastle as we continue on our journey to net zero. Saul has been a great friend to Newcastle, and it's wonderful to welcome him back. I'm sure he'll tell you his own wild tales of his times in Newcastle, but he has been a great source of inspiration and advice to me in my role as Lord Mayor. We've caught up on podcasts, we've caught up a number of times over the last few years to really look at how local government can work really closely, as we always do with our community, to drive this change from grassroots up. So it's just truly fantastic, and I have more formal words to say about you, Saul, which you'll love, I'm sure, or be terribly embarrassed. As you already know, and many people, you're an engineer and entrepreneur specialising in clean and renewable energy technologies. You're the author of 3 books. I'm sure many of you have read them here, Electrify and The Big Switch being 2 of them. And you've recently turned your attention from independent research and development to policy work and writing, including founding Rewiring America, Rewiring Australia, and Rewiring Aotearoa, non-partisan organisations dedicated to electrification and decarbonisation. As many of you would also know, under Saul's leadership, Rewiring America helped shape the very, very important US Inflation Reduction Act, which has basically triggered the largest ever investment in energy transition and electrification that we've seen in the Western world. So since returning to Australia in 2021, Saul has thankfully focused on Rewiring Australia, and you have an amazing and ambitious vision to electrify everything, and we share your passion. So please welcome the indomitable Saul Griffith.
I've already messed it up though. Thank you, Nuatali. My new bad joke when I come home from America is to say, isn't it nice to come back to a first world democracy? So I just spent 3 weeks there, and it is a pretty interesting 3 weeks in America. I won't talk a lot about that. I used to live here in Newcastle, though. I actually live just probably 500 metres that way, if I've got my bearings right. And I took my first job in industry on the Rodden bar mill as a 20-year-old. So I remember Newcastle when it was a little dirtier and a little more steel. And it's lovely to come back. When my wife and I relocated from America, we basically tossed a coin of Wollongong versus Newcastle. And I think they're both fabulous cities. There you go. That's probably the way to get out of that. All right, so rewiring and electrification of everything. It really is a privilege through Nuatali's leadership and other people I've met in Newcastle. This city is honestly leading the world in leaning into this energy transition and this electrification, and the fact that, you know, you can fill a hall like this on a Thursday night is testimony. This phenomenon that's happening here is not yet happening in America, where the community is showing genuine interest and leaning in and figuring out how to make the transition. So we've already talked about the books. I have gone from being an engineer to a writer. When you're in your 10-year-old daughter's class and her classmates ask you what you do, don't tell them you're a typist. That was the wrong thing to say. My daughter prefers if I say I'm an inventor or something that sounds exciting. But I'm basically a typist now, and you can read my typing. The first book there, Electrify, that was really Derek Thompson of The Atlantic magazine in the US recognised it. He reviewed the book and said this is the sneakiest bit of public policy writing he'd ever written. It was really a book written for an audience of one. That was whoever was going to win the presidency in 2020. It was based on this work. This is the one chart that I'm going to quiz you all on at the end of the show. This is called a Sankey diagram or a spaghetti diagram. It maps all of the energy flow in the American economy from inputs on the far left that are coal, gas, nuclear power, solar, wind, hydroelectricity, and then it goes into all the sectors. The blue is industry, the purple is commercial buildings, red is households, green is transportation. I may have got the colours wrong, but you get the point. And from this you can determine pretty crazy, interesting things like 0.2% of US energy flow is used in abattoirs, 0.6% of US energy flow is getting kids on school buses to work, 0.5% of US energy flow is using diesel to move coal from the mine to where it's burned in a power station, and things like that. So Electrify summarised all of this and said, well, to get this economy, an economy like this, to zero emissions, you need to do nearly everything you do there, but you need to do it with electricity, and you need to generate that electricity with zero emissions. And that's really the summary for the night. So I've broken up this talk into some bad news. We'll get it over early. Some good news, some better news, some incredible news, some hard news, and then local news, finishing on local news, because I think that's where this energy transition is going to happen. Here's the bad news. We deceived ourselves. I was glad that Nuatali said, I'm going to go straight to the punchline here, that you're going to try and decarbonise Newcastle by 2040. That's actually the correct target. So this graph here shows you if we had no climate policies, we'd go on that red line, we'd get 5 degrees of warming. Current policies, this graph was before the IRA, were about 3 degrees. It might have brought us down to about 2.5 degrees. And you can see the bottom there, the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree pathways, very steep reductions. This is it just measured in carbon. This is from the IPCC's latest report. So we put 40 billion tonnes a year of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You've got to get it to zero, that's the horizontal line across there, by about 2050, and then it goes negative. So unfortunately, in the early 2000s, a couple of scientists conceived of an idea to do energy with negative emissions, called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And unfortunately, the economists at the IPCC seized upon this and were like, oh, you know how we can make our emissions work out? If we use negative emissions later this century, we can buy ourselves time earlier this century. So you'll now see that most of the emissions pathways modelled by the IPCC have minus 10 billion tonnes or gigatons of negative emissions later this century. To put that in perspective, all of the coal, all of the oil, all of the gas we pull out of the ground every year weighs 10 billion tonnes. So to hit our 1.5 degree targets requires burying as much carbon dioxide every year as we currently pull fossil fuels out of the ground. Most scientists don't believe that that happens. In the page 4096 of the IPCC report, they actually say so. You might ask yourself, why did this happen? I'll skip that graph, this is easier to understand. On the left, that's the amount of coal, oil and gas you can burn by 2100 to hit a 1.75 degree target. They didn't use 1.5 degrees because that's now extremely difficult to hit. The graph on the right is how much, the graph on the left is how much you can burn if you accommodate all of those negative emissions. The graph on the right is how much you can burn if you only count on a little bit of reforestation in terms of the negative emissions. You can calculate the amount of carbon dioxide between those two lines, that's done here. And so when the IPCC started using this accounting method, they were encouraged by countries like Australia and Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Russia, meaning the fossil producers, to double down on these negative emissions. It was the primary strategy of the coalition government before this one. And the reason why is the value of the carbon that we allowed them to get with these negative emissions is worth $37 trillion at wholesale or $300 trillion at retail. So we're literally going to pay the fossil fuel industry somewhere between $30 and $300 trillion by the end of the century for those negative emissions, and that's why they corrupted the process. So it really means net zero 2050 isn't good enough. It really means actual zero by 2040 is what we have to hit. So New Italy, you're bang on target, thank you. Just get all of the rest of the mayors in the world to line up behind you. All right, so that was pretty depressing. The good news is that the market transformation is coming along. So this is work that we proudly did at Rewiring America. This was my 1.5 seconds with the president when he launched the IRA. We like fist bumped over a fence. Said thanks for your work. This is the Rewiring America team that did it. You can see me and Ari and Alex in the back. The two guys with the funny ties, they worked for Chuck Schumer. He introduced the bill to the House. So they did all the heavy lifting, and then the curly-haired guy and I there basically used all the data in that first graph we showed you to help them write the bill, so that was pretty good. Here, I'll miss that one. Oh, I'll go back. No, I won't miss that one. If you break down the bill, it's about $400 billion US. The big yellow bit at the bottom is making green electricity. So that's wind farms and solar farms. The orange bits in the middle is converting our cars and converting our homes and converting our businesses into run on electricity. This is what you might call electrification. That piece of the bill wasn't going to be there until we got on the task. So we're very proud that that's the contribution that Rewiring America helped make. And then there's a little bit of electrification of industry and some hydrogen in the top there, $400 billion. The interesting thing about it, and this is what we mean by market transformation, is these are just incentives. So you might get a $7,500 incentive in the US to buy an electric vehicle, but the electric vehicle costs $50,000. That means the government spends $7,500 but moves 8 times as much money, $50,000, so it's leveraged 8 to 1. You can go line by line through the bill, and there's about 200 sections of the bill, and I've done this, and it's tedious. You just have to trust me, but if you do all of the multipliers, the 369 billion actually will leverage about $2 trillion in private capital, and this is over a 10-year window. The other interesting thing is because it's a tax bill, this is already proving incredibly popular. Americans love nothing more than a tax deduction. It's probably going to deploy $1 trillion instead of the 369 billion from the government, which will move closer to $10 trillion of private capital. So that's when they say this is the largest investment in climate ever, this is what's going on, and it was designed to permanently transform the marketplace for all of the energy into the economy. So in some respects, electrification is now inevitable and we can't stop it. In fact, the only car company that hasn't announced a date where it stops making petrol vehicles is Toyota. Everyone else has said we'll stop by 2025 or 2030 or 2035. So it's inevitable that we electrify everything. The only question in a climate sense is, are we going to do it fast enough to get an outcome better than 2 degrees? This is a calculator we launched on the day that the IRA launched. You can enter your home address in the US. This is my address in San Francisco. We qualify for $33,000 US in incentives to electrify the kitchen, electrify the water heater, electrify all the pieces. Rewiring Australia is working very hard to lobby the Australian government that this is what we should be doing at federal policy level to help every single Australian afford this transition. And in fact, it pays for itself in Australia, and we'll come to that point later. So here's the happy news. This is the pay for itself issue. Forever there's been the environmental mantra that came out of the 70s was reduce, reuse, recycle. We were going to solve every environmental problem narratively with, if you're just a little bit colder and you drive a smaller car and you wear a thicker sweater, we'll solve, all of the environmental problems. The narrative was pretty bad for the environment. It was like, if we all sacrifice enough, we'll be a little bit less fucked. And it's funny, but Rewiring America really came from a different place. Like, we've tried that for 50 years. We can all agree it hasn't really moved the needle on environmental action. We need a positive vision for the future, and we need something that isn't going to try and force moral decisions on everyone. It's going to be like, you can have your lifestyle, it just has to be electric, and it will be better and cleaner and better for your health. And so that's where the idea for Rewiring America really came from. But the other environmental problem of the 1970s was like, whose fault is it? Is it your fault as the consumer, or is it the fossil fuel companies that are selling you the drugs? It's both. Anyway, you can calculate how much fault it is of whose. Turns out it's the same in the Australian domestic economy as it is in America. 42% of emissions that you make are decisions that only you can make. You buy the car for your household, so you're choosing whether it's running on petrol or electricity, you're choosing what heats your home, etc. So there's another way of thinking about this is everyone's like, panic, 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 climate's an emergency, want you to solve it tomorrow. Really, the rewiring advice is, I want you to panic, and now I want you to hurry up and make 6 decisions really well in the next 20 years. Right? So the next time you buy a car, buy it electric. The next time you do a kitchen renovation, put in the electric hob, not the gas one. Don't feel guilty if you're not doing it tomorrow. If we all do it at this natural rate of replacement, we have a pretty good hope of coming in under 2 degrees. Anyway, 42% of the emissions are yours. The other is the infrastructure of your life. This is why it's important for cities to do their share of the burden. You share part of the local swimming pools and the garbage collection and all of these other things that use energy to run. And the city is complicit in some of that other 58%, as is industry and the things that keep our economy humming, and we need to do those as well. But the reason we emphasise these 42% is it's still hard to decarbonise industry. You still can't go out and buy an electric or hydrogen garbage truck. They're prototypes, yet the things that we can do to get those critical near-term emissions are the things in your home. So that's electrifying what we call the demand side machine. There's the supply side where you get the energy from. There's the demand side where you use it. That's your cars and homes. People used to think that the hard to decarbonise sectors are industry and the electricity generators. There's only a few thousand coal plants and steel mills and aluminium smelters in Australia. There's 100 million of these demand side machines. So I think this is just as hard by the sheer number and volume. Anyway, electrifying those things is going to do, I'm going to make an extraordinary free set of steak knives remark here. It'll cut your energy use in half, it'll improve your health, it'll improve your quality of life, it'll lower your energy bills, and free set of steak knives. How does that happen? So the reduce, reuse, recycle efficiency, your way to the win. 50-year narrative was represented by the two bars on the left and in the middle. So that's a petrol Ford Ranger on the left, and that's electric Ford Ranger equivalent on the right. Only about 20% of the energy that goes into the petrol Ford Ranger actually moved the truck, and the big black bit there is the waste. We did make those cars a little bit more efficient, so that's the middle bar, in the last 50 years using fuel economy standards. The extraordinary thing is if you have an electric car and you power it, and it's the same size and weight, so I'm not making any judgment about the size of your car, just that it's electric. Same size and weight electric car will use about a quarter of the energy or a third of the energy of your petrol car. We did 50 years of efficiency trying to make natural gas water heaters slightly better. So that goes from the one on the left to the one on the right. They went from 90% efficient to 95% efficient. But if you have a heat pump water heater and you're running it off your rooftop solar, it'll use a third, or in a Newcastle climate, a quarter of the energy. Again, a huge win. Same is true for the heating your home with a space heater. Even the kitchen hob or the gas stove, an electric induction stove will use half the energy of a gas stove because the blue flames aren't going up around the side. They're just, all the energy is concentrated. And of course, the biggest waste in Australia is when we burn coal to make electricity, or when we burn gas, 60 or 70% of the energy goes up the smokestack as lost waste heat. When you make electricity with solar and wind, it's like that third graph on the right. Very little of the energy is wasted. It all is electricity delivered to your home. So I think this is the most extraordinary picture I can show you. Sorry that it's a little bit nerdy. You may not be able to read the numbers, but at least you can compare the sizes. The first bar is the average Australian household today, 102 kilowatt hours of energy per day. Most of it is in the vehicle fuels, that big grey block. A little bit is in the generation losses for making the electricity on the top. And the useful stuff is on the bottom: cooking, water heating, space heating, cooling. If you did everything I just said, electrify everything in the house, ignore traditional efficiency. So this is the same leaky Australian house that was built in the 50s with cracks in the windows and no insulation. Same, slightly larger than you really need car. Your energy use will go down 64% if it's all electric. So that is the efficiency that we spent 50 years looking for. The efficiency is the electrification. It does, however, mean that your electricity use is going to go up about 280%. So we need to deliver about 3 times as much electricity to Australia in the future than we do today. But it's a huge efficiency win, or as economists have a special fancy term, this is productivity. That makes it sound good, doesn't it? All right, this is the other super cool picture. It's a few years old now, and inflation has made it irrelevant. But what I'm trying to show, that first bar is the price of electricity from the grid. Today is 27 cents a kilowatt hour. It's probably about 35 cents a kilowatt hour now. That's how far it's come in 2 years. Rooftop solar is about 4 cents a kilowatt hour. That's that second graph. This is the Australian miracle and the lesson that we have to teach the world about how to do this energy transition. Yes, we do have good sunshine, but we actually have the most efficient solar installation market in the world. I paid about 90 cents per watt in Australian cents to install my solar in Wollongong. I paid a little over $9.50 to install solar on my house in San Francisco. And the difference, it's the same solar cells, the same inverters, the same components. The difference is it takes you 90 days to get a permit in the US, it's 24 hours here, all of these other things. So Australia actually has a blueprint for how to take what they call the soft costs or the bureaucracy out of this. And it gives you this incredible result where that rooftop solar is the cheapest energy ever delivered at retail to humans ever. To emphasize it in something easier to understand, if you drive a Ford Ranger to work, no judgment, you're paying 20 cents a kilometre to drive it. If you had an electric Ford Ranger you were running it off rooftop solar, it would cost you 1 to 2 cents per kilometre. So this is why this is a no-brainer for Australia. We import $50 or $60 billion worth of foreign oil every year. It's bad for our trade balance. We could be running all of our cars and vehicles on solar. Those translate to economic savings. So you might ask what this graph is. The first 2 pink ones, that is to say, a couple of years ago it was $5,000 or $6,000 a year to run an Australian household. That's for everything you use: electricity, petrol, diesel, LPG, and gas. That's gone up in the last few years because of Putin and other effects. You can see then the third bar there in 2022, there's a big grey bit. That's finance. So what if I could loan you the money tomorrow? I'd need to loan you somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000. So that instead of buying a petrol car, you could pay the little bit extra to get the electric one. Instead of buying the gas water heater, a little bit extra to buy the electric one, etc., and you finance it. In 2022, the cost of that finance would be more than you were paying in fossil fuels. In 2023, it's a little bit more, but the gap is closing. And really this year is the year where Australia goes through the economic transition, where if I could loan every Australian household the money to buy all the electric things, nearly every Australian household would save money. Curiously, if you have a lot of teenagers who use a lot of hot showers and drive a lot of kilometres, you save money more than if you're a really if you're a very frugal retiree, the economics take a little bit longer to work out for you. But the larger point is this now works for a household. This is extraordinary. It's also anti-inflationary. A weird part of my job is I'm now writing a paper with the head of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand saying electrification is anti-inflationary. You can see this is a graph of the total cost of all of the energy prices into an Australian household from 1990 to 2020. And you can see it going from $2,000 a year up to $6,000 a year. You can see some of the volatility from COVID and Ukraine war, etc. And then you can see in 2022 or something, I give a straight line across to the right. What I'm really saying is if you buy solar energy, you're buying 20 years of energy up front. And you're fixing you're paying the finance cost, which is pretty much fixed for the 20 years into the future once you've purchased it. So that's the anti-inflationary effect, and it's true of all of the renewables. A lot of money to buy them up front, but once you put them on finance, they take the inflation out. And so the story I just told you gets better and better every year because fossil fuels are still inflating. But the renewables and the batteries and the cars are getting cheaper, so they're actually, you can see by 2030 it's an even better line down there at the bottom. Not only anti-inflationary, but getting better every year. So incredible news, and this is what I'm really showing you is the secret on how you build an economic argument to try and win the government to make better policy for the people, because I think that's what they're meant to do. This is the story for Australia. What this has done is literally count, there's 11 million households, you won't be able to quite read the numbers there, but we've put solar on 3.5 million odd households in Australia, which is extraordinary. There's another 3.5 million that would be sensible. We've only put batteries on 250,000, we probably should put batteries on 5 million households. You add all of these up, and this is all of the machines we need to install over the next 20 years. Maybe I'll use this slide to make a really important point. Everyone thinks that the heroes of climate are going to be some boffin like me or some politician who makes the good policy, but we need a cultural shift in Australia that makes the tradie the hero and the saviour of the day, right? So someone's got to go out and get on 10 million roofs, someone's got to go out and install 100 million machines, and it's going to be the tradies that do it. And they're also the front line, they're the marketing, they're the service, they're the sales, they're the whole stack. Right now, they're not necessarily, your water heater kicks the bucket, they're like, mate, just get gas again, it's faster, right? We need to make them the cultural heroes of the moment. In fact, Rewiring Australia is sponsoring the best tradie surfer at the Narrabeen surfing competition in a couple of weekends. Apparently they have data that 80% of tradies have surfed in the last month. I don't know if it's true, but someone told me it was true. But maybe tonight we're launching the Tradies for Climate movement here in Newcastle. And I'd like everyone to, I think it is a little bit funny, but I think we need to take it seriously, right? That's the cultural transformation we need to make. This is a very nerdy physicist thing. These are called adoption curves. So it's got the time on the bottom. These are all the fundamental machines that households need to change: the electric cars, the solar, the water heater, the space heat. On the left of the chart is what percentage of them are already electric. So that means the blue line, the kitchen stove, 50% in Australia are already electric. But it means, you want to be all electric by Nuttall's 2040. You need to have these very, very fast, what's called adoption curves. Basically, this means because the cars last 20 years and because the water heaters last 15, every time anyone in Australia has a water heater kick the bucket or a car kick the bucket, the next one they have to buy is electric. And we need policies, we need workforce, meaning the tradies need to be prepared to sell it. We're still not there in Australia. We need policies at every level of government to make that happen very quickly. But we use those curves basically to figure out if you electrified all of those things and you calculate how much money you save as you go. I realise these graphs aren't showing terribly well, but here it is. This is the good one. The dark yellow thick line at the bottom there is how much money the government would have to loan out if they were loaning to every Australian who said, I'd like to electrify, enough money to cover the difference between the water heater they're going to buy and the electric one. If we did that for every Australian and we did it over the next 30 years, what the green number is the collective savings of our 11 million households after we've electrified. Because we're not buying foreign oil anymore, because rooftop solar is cheaper than coal and gas, those savings accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. And really, this is the only slide I should have shown you. If Australia went all in on electrifying everything starting today, we'd save $1.7 trillion as a nation by 2050. So when the shock jocks and the other people say, no, we can't afford to do this, there's still a narrative that we can't afford to solve climate change. The reality is we can't afford not to. This is as an economist would say, this is the biggest boost to Australian economic productivity that we could possibly have had in the last century. And so we need to align all policies at all levels of government to get it done. There'll also be savings for small businesses and other areas of the economy. This is just the households. We would save 150 grand per household by 2050. It's worth doing. All right, here's the difficult news. Industry is still hard. If you look at the emissions for Australia, under the dotted line, that's all of the coal we export. Above the line is all the emissions that actually count as the IPCC measures it on Australia. The domestic emissions are on top. That's households, that's small businesses and the commercial sector, including buildings like this. But the big section below that is called trade emissions. So 40% of Australia's emissions are using fossil fuels in Australia to prepare stuff for export. So this is using burning diesel in Australia to get coal from mine to port and away, for example. Those industries are still hard. The reason the economics work great for households and for small businesses is because that's where you pay retail for oil or you pay retail for natural gas. So the difference between natural gas coming out, it's $4 a megajoule in Victoria once you've got it there and got it in the gas network, but it's, $4 a gigajoule, but it's about 50 cents a gigajoule when it's being fed into industry. So this is why industry is hard. This is why we need to invert the narrative, and Australia is particularly guilty of this. Everyone's like, oh no, we can't afford to decarbonise until it's a slam dunk for industry. But we need those early emissions now, which is why we should do the things that make economic sense now, which is our households, our cities, our small businesses, because that's how we buy ourselves enough time to do those trade emissions. And how are we going to win that? We're going to win that by having the cheapest wind and solar in the world, access to, Australia is the first, second, third or fourth largest producer of the 10 critical elements we require for this energy transition, and that's, humble things like iron and aluminium, but that's also nickel, copper, all of lithium. Australia produced 55% of the world's lithium last year. Like we win in any version of this energy transition where we try. We're just not trying yet. All right, here's local news. This is why it's going to be great. That story for households is good, but it's even better when you think about a community. So I live in Austinmer. It's a very average Australian suburb. It's got 2,500 people in it. you can sort of read the numbers. Anyway, we're slightly economically above average, but we're not crazy. We're definitely not Woollahra. We live in 6 suburbs. You'll notice one of them is called Coaldale. The coal seam goes to the surf break in Coaldale. You can see the black line all the way to the water. So we're coal country too. Not trying to beat you, Hunter. The reason this area is interesting is we're all connected to one local substation. The substation is the basic subunit of an electricity grid. And a typical substation, that's the ugly thing that's hidden behind the railway tracks in the wrong part of town. It connects typically through 4 or 5 strings to 4,000 or 5,000 households down that string. And so we need all of that electricity to get delivered. So we need to triple that electricity as we electrify all the cars and homes. Anyway, in our suburb today, we buy the average household buys $1,000 worth of electricity from the grid, mostly generated by coal, some from gas. Every household buys $3,500 worth of petrol or diesel. That's actually gone up to about, this is a couple of years ago, it's about $5,000 a household now. We buy gas probably from Victoria. All of that money leaves your community immediately, right? Or, you know, think about the petrol one in particular. We have one petrol station in our area. They sell 3 things that can kill you. They sell fossil fuels, they sell nicotine, and they sell sugar. And they employ 1 person in the community doing it, right? So huge amounts of money leave your community on a one-way ticket. What could we be doing instead? If you look at the rooftop solar potential, we could produce easily 80% of the energy we need from our rooftops. We will also need some wind, so we're also hoping to do offshore wind as you do. That's a great idea. But if you think about it, instead of $5,000 a year leaving the community, we're going to save, like I said earlier, $5,000 a year per household. And actually, because we're paying local tradies, remember this is the most of the work done by tradies, they're local, is going to result in $5,000 or $6,000 in community spending a year, so per household. And if you add that up, you know, this year we're spending $15 million a year on petrol and diesel and gas. We spend $4 million on electricity from the grid. In the future, what we could be doing is still spending $4 million on electricity from the grid, spending $1.5 million on local electricians, and spending about $20 million of those community savings, 55% of which is going to be spent in our local LGA. So if you think about, somewhere between $10 and $20 million a year will stay in a community of 10,000 people instead of leaving a community of 10,000 people. This is how you gold plate the surf club. This is how the RSL club gets a do-over every 5 years. Like, this is the greatest possibility for local economic renewal Australia has ever seen, precisely because money won't leave your community to buy fossil fuels that typically are not produced in your community. So there's a fantastic story for us. It begins here in your house, electrifying the solar, the battery, the water heater, car, the stove, the space heaters. I'd like a sign. I actually saw there were handouts outside. It looks like you did this, but neater. Congratulations, Newcastle. Like I said, you're leading the world. Just finish with a couple of thoughts, because this is actually where the fight is. You don't know, this is a recruitment drive. I need you all to come to the greatest political shit fight in Australian history. It's going to play out in this election and probably for the next 5 years. We need to get, for the top 10% of Australian households, they can probably afford to pay cash for the electric vehicle and the battery and the solar, and they're saving money tomorrow. And I'm actually writing a new book right now, and I've got a few friends who are writing of their experience electrifying their whole lives. And they've done it, and then, one guy, he lives on the northern beaches, not to shame anyone from the northern beaches, but he's saving $8,000 a year. But he could afford the money to buy it. Probably the next 20% of households after those top 10% can borrow money against the mortgage, or they've got easy access to credit. So maybe, they can do it too. It just feels a little bit more risky, especially in a high interest rate market. But then I think we have the 70% Australians who, quite frankly, the banks won't lend the money to. They're a single mother with a nursing job and they have to drive across the city. They are precisely the people who would benefit the most from saving $3,000 a year on their commute, and they won't have access to the credit and the finance. So their climate policy was very American. We're going to throw money at this. What Australia needs to do is throw concessional finance at this and loan Australians money at the lowest rate that's available, which is the federal borrowing rate of our federal government, to help all of Australians. So we're big advocates for policies that look like that coming into the next election. So if you hear people requesting for that, say, I want that too, and then let's create a movement and march on Canberra. Here's the other thing. We literally designed the electricity market to protect the existing assets. So we privatised the Australian electricity market in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And when you're selling something, you want to inflate the price of it to the buyer. So we were selling our electricity market generators and distribution transmission systems to Asian buyers. And so they wanted to know that the asset was worth a lot. So we gold-plated it and we promised them long-term security in the electricity market. And we designed the National Electricity Market, the NEM, governed by an agency called AEMO, to kind of protect the value of those generators, the traditional coal-fired power plants, the gas plants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, because they're utilities, that they're regulated by the government, and we provide guaranteed rates of return on the capital investments of all of the players in that electricity market. So we guarantee a 7, 8, 9, 10% return on investment for a Singaporean fund to invest in Australian generation and transmission. We do not, however, guarantee the Australian households' investment in rooftop solar or an electric vehicle or all of these other components. This is absurd. The Australian households will be collectively the largest generator of electricity in Australia on their rooftop solar. Australian household vehicles will be collectively the largest battery in Australia, 5 times as big as the Snowy Hydro. So we've now very undemocratically granted a monopoly with a guaranteed return of investment to all of these old energy system market operators, yet we're not guaranteeing the returns of investment of the Australian household. You should be enraged. I don't know why you haven't stood up and thrown a chair at an energy regulator already tonight. If you see an energy regulator, I recommend this. But this is the fight of the century, right? We have to redesign our electricity market rules basically overnight so that it incentivizes Australians to make these investments, not disincentivizes them. We've just allowed some of the distribution companies to charge you to feed solar back into the grid, right? This is exactly the wrong direction. I want Nuatali's solar to charge my battery when I'm away, and I want to plug my car in at night, and she can use my car battery to cook her dinner on her induction stove. We should have a transparent electricity market that enables those neighbour-to-neighbour actions, and we're going to have to fight like hell to get it, because currently there's only a voluntary representation for Australians on the national electricity market. We don't have a board seat, right? We're not trending well. I think there's 800 pages of proposed rule changes submitted per week, not by us, not by the people, but by all the people trying to protect their monopolies. So you can't even read it to keep up. So this is a huge fight, and so that's the second part of my recruitment drive. If anyone is like, I don't know, a retired engineer who loves detail, take your name at the end of the talk, and I'll get you to go and start sitting in on some regulatory hearings for us. We're also piloting our electrification, our community 2515. There's 10,000 postcodes in Australia. We need every community to be experimenting. How we do this on the ground, no one knows exactly how to do it yet. What I love about being here at this event, and why I easily said yes, although Newcastle like, you didn't say yes 18 months ago. It's been busy, is because, provably your city is putting its money where its mouth is and trying to figure out this, but we need it to be happening everywhere in Australia, so we can know how to do it for every community. And the other thing is to win the macroeconomic argument. We just have to put the smack down on the bullshit in the Australian every weekend and say, no, economically this is the largest productivity increase Australia has ever had, because there are still large interests who wish to slow this down for very cynical reasons, namely protecting their profits. So I'll finish there. Thanks very much. Hopefully we go to some questions, or maybe I went too long.
I think that what I've heard the most too with all of the presentations I've heard from you, Saul, is just that it's all about the power of community and the collective action that we need to take as a community. And I recognise that you say that we all need to do these 6 things in the next 2 decades when we can, but it's a personal journey for everybody, and we all need to do the things that we can do. So for me, that's a really important message, and it's the motivation for us at the City of Newcastle to run this event tonight. It's all about what we need to do as a community to get to this net zero target by 2040. So this is where it's the part of the evening that we want to hand over the microphone to you all, and we want you to come up and ask the questions that you might have for Saul or for Councillor Clausen. But before I do that, I just want to introduce Kristen McDonald, who's in the audience today. She is Saul's colleague working for Rewiring Australia, and just while we have community members that are coming up, if you'd like to come to the centre of the audience just here, where Izzy is, or for Izzy or Councillor Clausen. But firstly, I just wanted to ask you, Kristen, to tell us a little bit more about what Rewiring Australia are doing to help communities electrify, and what you're doing to help kickstart electrification campaigns across Australia.
I guess as Saul said, we really believe that we need to do a lot of that advocacy work to get those top level changes needed, so we can electrify everything fairly and rapidly and at a speed and affordably for everybody and every Australian. But at the same time, we simultaneously need to get on with the job. And this is where we really think that communities are so important, that whole neighbourhood effect. In Australia, every year 1 million new gas appliances get sold, and that's 1 million decisions we need to change today. We have 11 million households that need to get fully electrified, so that is millions of decisions that need to get changed. And as Saul mentioned, cost is a huge barrier to people, but it isn't the only barrier. Another one that is a really common one that we see is trust. So a lot of people might know that there are things they might want to do, but they don't actually know who to trust, who to go, and what to do about it. And that's where communities are perfect place to kind of overcome that barrier, because who better to trust than your neighbours? And as much as, listening to someone like Saul is inspiring, and we yet to have that teleportal thing where we can beam him into every household, it's those conversations that we have with each other that are actually going to have the most direct impact to ensure that those millions of decisions are the right ones. So at Rewiring Australia, one of the things that we're trying to do is to bring together community groups, or even just people who are interested in not only electrifying their home, but how they're going to electrify their street or their neighbourhood or their whole community. And there's lots of different ways that we can go about that, and we're not trying to direct communities what to do, but we are trying to at least streamline that process a little bit, so we don't have a whole bunch of groups all around Australia in their own corner reinventing the wheel. So that's in the form of maybe we can just share ideas, we're sharing resources, we're coming up with guides, there's a whole range of events that groups can put on, or workshops or information sources. So I really encourage you to be active and either join or become one of those groups, or at the least to not only go home tonight and think about your own home, but go home and think about what influence you can have on everybody else's, because it's wonderful to see what the city's doing, but they can't physically change all of our houses, so we need to make sure that it's up to us as well. So if you want to join part of this electric national movement that's at that grassroots community level, then we'd love to hear from you. So thank you.
So don't be shy. Do we have any questions from the floor? Please join the line in the centre there. Thank you very much. And we'll start off with our questions for either Saul or Councillor Clausen.
This one's for Saul. I'm about to install my 8th solar system on Tuesday in Kiama. of all places. And when you do this, you end up having to put in a smart meter. My question is, the answer to the last question you had is, why can't my smart meter be smart? Why do I have to sell my electricity to the same person I buy it?
You really just emphasised my last point, which is we're still trying to regulate the system as though it's the 20th century and all of the electricity flows one way from the coal plant to your door. But we need to design the regulatory and the market rules for two-way flow. There's a stink being kicked up in the regions because of all the transmission lines that are going to be needed. The more electricity you generate locally and share locally, the fewer of those transmission lines we need. The Australian Electricity Market Operator, AEMO, when they look forward with their forward-looking models, the ISPs or integrated system plans, they don't model the delivered cost of electricity to Australian households when they try to figure out the lowest cost energy system. They only model the lowest cost of generation for their members, the big coal, the big wind and the big solar as well, but those things. If you modelled the lowest energy cost delivered to Australian households, you'd have an enormously different result with huge amounts more rooftop solar, not just on your roof, but on the roof of the Bunnings, on the roof of the school, on the roof of the surf club and the church, and you would design a set of market rules that would optimise sharing that around. We're not there yet. You're realising it. You've probably, thankfully, the cost of solar over your 8 systems got lower and lower and lower, but the incentives to sell it back to the grid got worse and worse and worse because we're not designing for the future. And the only good news is that batteries are getting so cheap so fast that you'll probably put batteries on with this set and you'll solve a little bit of that problem for yourself. Is that the best way to do it? Not necessarily, but until the electricity market catches up, that is the best way to do it. But like I said, we're raising an army. We're going to assault on the government and the energy regulators because we have to change these rules if we're going to get Australia to get this job done on time.
Firstly, Saul, I'd like to thank you. I think it was an absolutely brilliant presentation. And the question I've got is, where is your recruiters list? So I can sign up.
Uh-oh, someone took me seriously. See Kristen over here?
I'm ex-Sydney. I've been up here since '97. I actually started life as a mechanical engineer, then a systems analyst working at BHP, and worked in the actual energy industry since 2007.
This may sound a little bit odd, and I don't mean to stereotype you, but a large section of any audience I speak to are retired engineers who are angry because they're, my father, also a retired engineer, he competes with his golf buddies on who generated the most solar this week and who got the best price when they were selling it back into the market. And we need to deploy the special skills of all those retired engineers in creating the public stink. Like, we won't get the change we want unless we put pressure on these market regulators, and that's in Australian politics as in everywhere in the world. The politicians really can only go as far as they're pushed by their electorate. And we have not been loud enough about fixing these market rules. Part of that is just because it's so maddeningly complicated and you just give up trying to figure out which retail electricity plan is best. That's where most people are at. So we need the engineers who have the patience to read to the end of the retail electricity plans to become a sort of a fighting force to argue for electricity market reform.
My name's James Wheeler. I'm with Climate Action Newcastle. We're great fans. We're supporters of Rewiring Australia. We began life 20 years ago with group buys for putting solar on roof. We're 100% with you. I'm curious, you've come from a neighbourhood that's facing very similar dynamics around offshore wind as we are. And I'm interested, you didn't really touch on offshore wind. I wondered if you could share with us your observations of the dynamic between offshore wind and the polarisation around offshore wind and household or domestic renewables. I can't help feeling that the two are interrelated, whether it's at an individual community level or whether it's a national policy level.
You promised me we wouldn't talk about politics tonight.
Welcome to Newcastle.
So I get the impression the bitterness over your offshore wind here isn't as bad as it is down south. Maybe it is. Well, let's not have that fight because that's one's but it's terrible in Wollongong. I am amazed at the misinformation and the disinformation. I have the impression that there's a quiet majority who secretly supports doing these things, but because we live in an echo chamber of whoever screams loudest on Facebook, it feels like the opposition is huge. I will say over the last year, they've got better and better and cleverer at the messaging, so it's getting closer and closer to not sounding completely irrational. So I worry that the resistance is getting smarter. I'm fascinated that the coalition's answer is socialised nuclear power. Right, this is the economic conservatives who want socialist nuclear power. That's an amazing response. The answer is, which a little bit of the partial answer is, we can do the majority of our domestic economy electrification on our rooftops and on the rooftops of Bunnings and in our communities, but we can't do all of it, so we're going to have some wind and some hydro and some other stuff. Internationally, because I do a lot of this work internationally, we're in fact booting up rewiring Taiwan as the next effort and rewiring the world next year. Internationally, I have to be agnostic to nuclear. There are countries that cannot get to zero without nuclear. So if you're a cold, dark country with a lot of people, high population density, you need nuclear power. Australia is the last country on that list. We can do this as a slam dunk with renewables. It'll be the cheapest way easily. So I was wondering whether I could kill the nuclear and the offshore wind, two birds with one stone, and I'm on track, so this is feeling good. Offshore wind will be cheaper than nuclear, so it's a good idea. It's the most reliable and predictable of all of the renewable resources in the very high capacity factors, so it's a good thing to do. I've worked in offshore wind. I can say convincingly it doesn't kill the birds and the whales and the babies, and it doesn't give you 4G or COVID. I really love the people who appreciate that joke. We should be doing it, and we need to do. We can't get there without some things that look like offshore wind. I'm a big advocate that you should incentivize the communities that build these things. We advocated heavily in Via Illawarra that any developer who's getting the printed monopoly contract to operate the farm actually pays the local community a dividend for any site. I think that helped build some credibility and support in favour of the project. I hope you're doing the same thing here. If the developer is making a few cents a kilowatt hour for 20 odd years, I think we calculated if the community was getting a half a cent a kilowatt hour, you'd be gold plating 3 public schools a year in perpetuity, right? So these things, because our communities get to power Sydney at great profit, it could be a great thing for our communities. I think that'll help you get people on side.
I'm Nick, I'm from the University of Newcastle, and we're doing a net zero grand challenge. One of the things I wanted to ask you, and I don't want it to sound negative at all, I wanted to understand in those calculations, if the cost of the infrastructure was taken into account. If you could just expand on that in terms of the grid, how much money we need to invest in that. That's all I wanted to ask.
We take into account it's hard to do the calculation perfectly, so we're going to have a very personal, private, wonky conversation in your presence for a minute here. We use sort of an average median price per, gigawatt hour kilometre for the transmission grid and the build out required. The uncertainty in doing the calculation is how much are we going to do in local generation versus how much we're going to do in regional, and the other uncertainty in the calculation is how well are we going to manage the electricity. So if in the future all of you rush home from these fabulous public lectures and you all charge your electric car overnight, that will mean we have to build a lot more stuff. If we can incentivize, because we overthrow the powers that be at AEMO, and we have two-way tariffs so that I can buy that gentleman's solar during the day to charge my car, and we put charging stations at every workplace in Australia, it'll all work out. You have to just guess at what those things are, and so I don't think I would necessarily satisfy you that we've done it perfectly, but I can say that we're trying to do our best at guessing a reasonable version of the future, and we include that infrastructure cost.
I was looking forward to coming to see this guy with the crazy hair. So I was thinking it was going to be a bit wild, but it was good anyway. Thanks anyway.
I will let you know. The only thing I have done since I got home from... I've only done two things since I got home from the US 24 hours ago. I got a haircut and a shave, and I bought a pair of shoes. And for those people who know me, it's probably the first time in 20 years I've actually worn shoes and short hair at the same time. Just for you, Newcastle.
Yeah, my name's Lee Shears. I'm the Secretary of the local Regional Trades Labour Council, Hunter Workers. I thought one of the pieces that I picked up that I thought was impressive that you don't hear a lot of is that clarity around what's important in the near and medium term in regards to renewable energy or the energy needs, and also then looking at what the long-term stuff is. A lot of the stuff that we hear that really muddies the conversations or the discussions around renewable energy, particularly here, but all right across the nation, is like you have a look at the needs of the high energy users in industry. So you're looking at, Tomago aluminium, and they support 6,000 jobs. You're looking at some of the future opportunities around hydrogen, where which is a higher energy to break the water. Can you sort of, I suppose, elaborate again or a little bit more, and how also maybe provide advice or direction on where we can get the information to get that sort of stuff out, about that process, the needs now and what the needs are later. I was in meetings today, and this is sort of, I suppose, a high priority topic for us. And then some of the challenges that we've got with our members is that, what about Tomago aluminium? They're going to need, I don't know, it's extraordinary the amount of power they would need, which actually takes the focus away from what's actually needed right here and right now. And some of the stuff that you talk about a mass march on Parliament to get them to make the changes to regulatory needs as well. So, does that make sense?
There are 17 questions, and that guy got them all. Yeah, I've lined all the questions up in my mind. Actually, here's how I'm going to summarise your question. If I was Anthony Albanese and I had the opportunity to sit down with Australia and tell them the short-term, mid-term and long-term way that this works out well for us, how do you piece all of those things together? And so...
That's what I was going to say.
There's a little bit of energy and coal goes into the steel making process, and that costs about 1/4 cent per kilowatt hour, 1/4 of 1 cent per kilowatt hour. Natural gas fed to industry straight from a port typically hits industry at 1 to 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour equivalent. You'll notice that that's below what solar and wind can generate, which is about 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you just went out today and tried to make steel with solar or wind, it'll be more expensive than steel that you have today. If you took that 3 or 4 cent solar or wind and you converted it into hydrogen, then you converted it from hydrogen back into electricity or into heat, it would actually cost you about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So the idea that we're going to make green hydrogen and sell green hydrogen to Korea and Japan to make steel is just, excuse me, stupid, because it would raise the price of steel. And so that's not going to happen. So a lot of the culture war around the energy transition is fear driven by we're going to lose jobs in these big industries that drive Australia, and that's aluminium, that's steel, and that's exporting our existing fossil fuels. So I think if you were Albanese, you'd say the technology to do that doesn't exist today, but we're confident that it will be there in 2030 or 2035. And so we need to get our emission reductions on the things that make economic sense today. That's why I'm emphasising a national electric vehicle financing scheme. That's why I'm going to give money to every council in Australia to install vehicle charging infrastructure. That's why I'm going to help every household electrify all their things. Because quite frankly, we need a decade before the industry transformation works. It's also going to take a long time to build rewiring. Unfortunately, they stole our, Rewiring Australia was Rewiring Australia first, and then the Labor announced Rewiring the Nation. Rewiring the Nation is all the big transmission projects. So that was the first real big climate policy of the new government. But it takes a long time to build those. It's going to take even longer now. We've turned it into a political football and all the communities are complaining. So it's like it's going to be 10 years before those big renewable projects end up connecting back into the grid. So another reason that I emphasise the things that you can do on your own roof and in your backyard now, it's really because you have to get the emissions reductions now, and it's going to take 5 or 10 years. You can't buy a wind turbine until 2030. The order book for the wind turbine companies is full. Right? It doesn't mean you shouldn't be planning your wind farm today and getting all the stuff ready, but it's not going to be in the water generating and hooked up until 2032 or something. So we have to plan all of the midterm things, which is building the transmission, building the big wind projects, building the big hydro projects and solar projects. So immediately electrify the vehicles, electrify the households. That's the only way we can hit our near-term emissions. Invest in the next decade in the transmission and the big renewables that will hook up and do it. And then not until you can make, not 100% renewables, but 2, 3, 4, 500% renewables can you think about the export industries. So we export about 4 times as much energy as we use in our domestic economy. So when Garno and those guys say we're going to be a renewable energy superpower, they mean the first 100% of renewable energy is for us, the next 600% of renewable energy is for the world. So I think 2% of energy that Americans use is Australian coal being burned in China to make Barbie dolls. And that's not exactly true, but it's close to true. 3% of energy used in America is Russian natural gas making Audis and IKEA furniture for sale in the American market. Right, so we, Russia, a few other countries are going to be big energy exporters. The right way for us to do it is take all of that sunshine and all of that wind power and put it in the really heavy industries that are... Newcastle is one of the only places where you can have this conversation. You know you're not going to lose everyone because you're an honest, hard-working city like Wollongong. And people kind of get it, right? We are at the interface of industry and the rest of the world. Australia only turns 1% of its bauxite into aluminium. So we export the other 99% as bauxite or alumina. If you converted all of the bauxite in Australia into aluminium in Australia, you would use the same amount of energy as all of the cars, all of the houses, all of everything else in Australia. We only convert, again, about 1% of iron ore into steel in Australia, and the 99% we export as iron ore. If you converted all of that iron ore to iron in Australia, we'd use about 300 or 400% of the power to power our domestic economy. It would also be $1 trillion industry, 10 times larger than all of our fossil fuel exports. So it's existential for Australia. Yes, it's good that we're making a lot of lithium, it's good that we have a lot of nickel and copper, but it's existential for Australia that we figure out how to do clean, green steel and iron domestically. But that too is going to go electric. Everyone's like, there's been a lot of, let's call them rich Australians who've been advocating for hydrogen to make green steel. That is going to be expensive. I have a friend in America. He runs a company called Form. They make a battery which was called an Edison cell, which is you literally let iron rust, and rusting iron is a battery. And they've been working on how do you recycle that battery or recharge it. And so they use electrochemistry. So they now have an aqueous process, meaning in water, where they can recharge rust back into iron. And it's extremely efficient, and you can make steel, you can make iron from iron ore at basically room temperature in a bucket of water, right? That technology now works, and he can make a little bit of dust in a cup about this big, but in 2035, you'd be able to use, Australia will have the cheapest wind and solar in the world, and we would be able to churn our iron ore into iron, and it will be much, much cheaper than, it'll be 10 to 20 times cheaper than using hydrogen to make steel in Korea. So we can win there too. So Albo should be saying cars and households for the win right now, then we'll build some transmission, because really, mostly you'll power the cars and the households off solar, but what we have to do is we've got to get Victorian wind to Queensland and we've got to get, Western New South Wales solar till the Pilbara and whatever it is. And so you need the transmission so that by 2040, we've got this highly electric, hugely profitable industry that's basically metallurgy for the world. We become the foundry for the world. I answered 17 questions, mate. You've got to give someone one.
You made reference down at Wollongong. We've got heaps of cookers up here, but we've been fighting them up here, because they've got a trade union. We've been working with our communities and our green groups to take them on and inform the rest of the community. That's the difference between here and the Illawarra. That's not happening down the Illawarra. So come along and join us.
Can I just jump in on the end of Lee's comment and just absolutely commend Lee and the work that you're doing with Hunter Workers. It is extraordinary the way that you're leaning into this conversation and helping the transition of our region. And to emphasise the point you were just making, Saul, I think in the past people saw the clean energy transition as being something that was only about white-collar jobs and not about opportunities in the region. This transition and what you just described is literally how we remain the powerhouse of New South Wales, as the Lord Mayor mentioned to begin with. There are amazing opportunities here in Newcastle in blue-collar jobs. There's more than a few surfing tradies in UE that are going to benefit from this transition. And so thank you for helping chunk it down for us tonight.
Perfect. I'll try and keep this one short. Thanks for coming, Saul. Rory Duff from Climate Industrials at Deloitte. In Australia and the US, I'm sure there's a significant portion of properties that are tenanted. So what's the policy strategy for getting the CapEx investment into households where the tenants are paying the energy, the gas?
I promise short answers. So here's the problem. You've got 20 years to get to zero emissions. If you look at the average age of homeowners in Australia and the average age of business owners in Australia, they're 40s to 50s to 60s. If you look at the average age of vehicle ownership, it's people in their late 20s, 30s, 40s. These are the assets that we need to electrify and get to zero. And, the political carrot here is that necessarily solving climate change on the time required looks like middle-class welfare, just because they're the asset holders. So I've given you exactly the answer you didn't want, which is renters are fucked. So you have to solve the split incentive. If you're pragmatic, and I was trying to be pragmatic, I would be, like the US, incentivizing the asset owners to buy the right assets with tax incentives and other things. But you have to follow that up with regulations that make them pass some of the value of their savings on to the tenant. And so it won't work if we believe in unfettered free market capitalism and tax deductions for the rich. So you have to figure out, I would be happy with the trade where I give the tax concession to the asset owner if they pass on more than 50% of the savings of this solar solution to the tenant. And then you've just got to figure out, if that's the spirit of it, how do I regulate that and write the policy for it?
Thank you very much for your talk, and also thank you to the city for putting this on. It's been great, so thank you, City. I'm going to come down from the macro to the micro, and specifically on motor cars and electric cars. Do you have any knowledge about anyone in Australia who might be hotting up a Monaro, an electric Monaro, to do some circle work in Southern Hats?
All right, I'm okay.
Doesn't have to be a Monaro, you know.
I was going to electrify a Monaro because a friend of mine had a Monaro and he wanted to electrify it. Before that, I was going to electrify a 1961 Lincoln Continental, and I really believe that it's, you know, just as we need to celebrate the tradies that are the heroes of this, like, we're not going to solve climate change by being boring. Like, you know, you have to decarbonize fun. And so to spill the beans and admit that I was the guy who's going to electrify a Camaro, it's actually going to be from my daughter. She's insisting that we electrify a 63 Combi 11 window. My son unusually is stuck between his electrification project with Dad an E.H. Holden station wagon or a Carmen Ghia. So it just take everyone raise your hand if you're Carmen Ghia, raise your hand if you're E.H. Holden. I'll let him know the results in the morning. I just had a 50th birthday in San Francisco. That was the last thing we did when we were in America with my American friends. We built 6 4-wheel drive electric go-karts, purpose-built for the party, and I invited my 200 closest friends and their kids, and I don't know if anyone, you know, this is crazy for me. I'm a climate nerd and I'm pro the environment, but I'm secretly a fan of Fast and Furious franchise. This is this 10, you know, bogans in Hot Rods series movie. It's a huge success. Anyway, in number 3, Tokyo Drift. That was the theme of my 50th birthday party. And so we had kids Tokyo drifting around. But like, it's, you know, we're going to solve this with electric jet skis, not by telling everyone no.
Thank you, City of Newcastle, especially for providing the EV charger that I've looked into. And now with my son Daniel, he's only 10, I've got a bit of a story to tell, and I'll get to the longer story first, but we came down from Coffs Harbour this afternoon. We'd love to see you up in Coffs Harbour soon. I'm building a fintech product called Our Leg Up. It's a solution hopefully to rewiring Australia, and what it does is it unlocks $7.1 trillion of accessible equity in Australia by creating a recurring revenue stream, potentially about 2.5% per annum. So what we can do with that is we can direct it towards
Is 7.1 trillion your estimate of Australian property values?
There's actually 10 point, so close to 11 is entire property market residential, and the value of inaccessible equity.
I love my nerds. They're all here tonight.
Yeah, so I'm not a retired engineer yet, but I am an engineer, so I tried to match your t-shirt as well. So yeah, I'd love to have a chat to you and introduce you to my son. He wants an autograph.
I am really struggling to hear the question.
It's a recruitment drive for you to go and see your son after the event.
Oh, I want to go see your son. You've got a 10-year-old? Let's go go-karting.
So basically what we've done here is with the value of inaccessible equity in Australia, which no one can really get a loan against, we've turned that into a force field. So it's a way to generate a recurring income stream instead of going to governments and bitching for debt products.
Here's another way of saying this. I think this gentleman here and I, we're going to violently agree that our kids are cool, but also that finance is the secret for Australia. And our residential property market is worth something like $10 trillion. Literally, on the value that it will grow by over the next 20 years, you can finance the entire energy transition and with money left over and save that $1.7 trillion. Like, we can do this. Now it's just about the mechanisms. I applaud that you're working on a market-based mechanism. I hope the government makes it easier for you to succeed.
My question is, how do we fix the regulator so when I leave my house...
Oh, baseball bats?
When I leave my house in the morning, I don't turn off my solar, so I'm not actually paying the grid to take my energy. And no, that's the question. How do we fix it?
I think we have to, I think if the question is how do you fix the regulator, and I'm going to take you really seriously, I do have fantasies involving the baseball bats, but I think we have to do something like go through the ACCC and show that we've created a non-competitive market where the Australian household is being screwed, and that this is not competitive trade practice. And you know, it's completely arbitrary why you're protecting generators over 100 kilowatts and not protecting generators under 10 kilowatts. And I think you can win that fight in the court through the ACCC, and so that may be one approach. I think the other approach is just to make a public outcry. I've been trying to work with all the parties on this, and there's people within every political party in Australia who really care for entirely different reasons. So the Liberal Party, because, you know, get the government out of these things, and the Labor Party for fairness reasons, but the Teals all seem particularly enraged by this issue. Anyway, this should be bipartisan. I think that to bring out the politics is to say, like, if we figure out how to collectively name the thing that's wrong and ask for the thing that's right, and we do it in really easy to understand to everyone language, and I've been, honestly, these types of events for me are practicing what is the slogan that we're going to put on bumpers to win this fight. And I think it's something like, you know, don't guarantee profits for overseas asset owners if you're not going to guarantee success for the Australian household. Make that 3 words. Really wide car. But like, I think you've got a legal mechanism, and then you've got a democratic public outcry mechanism, and I'd be interested if anyone's got a third mechanism. But like, I think we change it through politics or we change it through law.
You're very lucky you've come over the US in a nice summer, because we've been having a dismal winter here. It's been overcast, it's rainy. I don't know if it's climate change or if it's just an unlucky year, but my rooftop solar has produced a lot less solar this winter than last winter. Do you have any comments on rooftop solar production with perhaps climate change and bad weather?
So the unfortunate consequence of putting most of the change in climate change goes into the oceans as heat. Because it goes into the oceans as heat, it expresses itself in the atmosphere as moisture. And for every 1 degree Celsius of climate change, you get about 15% more moisture in the air. That moisture becomes clouds. If you live near an escarpment, all the clouds drop it just before they get up to the Western Plains. So we have it worse than you down in Wollongong. But yes, I'm not surprised that science, strangely, if you believe in that, would say that your observations are true and predictable. There'll be more variation, and there will be some years where you have less than the historical average because there's more moisture and more clouds in the air. Is that a problem? Not really. The batteries are getting bigger and cheaper. You know, again, so much of this comes back to electricity market rules. It was the sensible thing, because of the way that we designed the market rules 5 or 10 years ago, to buy a solar system that was big enough for your year-round average production. Now, really, the solar is so cheap that you should buy a solar system that's big enough for your winter use, and just don't worry that you're producing too much in the summer. The economics are so good you can afford to put twice as big a system in. So that's how it'll be solved, is just bigger, more efficient solar cells. Yeah.
Thank you so much to Saul, the Deputy Lord Mayor and Marnie. A lot of you would be wondering where to from here for the City of Newcastle and how we can actually get involved at a local level. So I wanted to make sure that at the end of the evening we could close out with some information and some hints that you'll be able to take home. And it is wonderful that Saul has come good with his promise to come to Newcastle and catch up with us all and share his wonderful knowledge. What I wanted to talk about particularly, we know our emissions profile in Newcastle, whereby 49% of our emissions are from electricity, 13% are from transport, and that demonstrates really an enormous potential for the acceleration of the electrification of our city and renewable energy as we strive to that net zero 2040 goal. I think really pertinent to tonight's discussion is understanding how much solar is on the rooftops in Newcastle, and that at this point in time is 28.8% of dwellings in the city of Newcastle. Yeah. Which means the availability of putting more solar on rooftops, and something that we can all do now, is part of what we want to do in working with our community here in Newcastle to help accelerate that solar take-up, because that is that short-term effort that we all need to try and reach our net zero goals, to try and stay under, well, I still hope for under 1.5 degrees. Obviously, in a practical sense, that might be 1.75, and I don't even want to think about 2 degrees. So we have a number of online resources here this evening, and this is part of our Empowering Newcastle program, which is really being launched tonight with Saul as the guest speaker. And some of those resources will be obviously online, there'll be action guides, and there'll be more events like this with different people to try and help educate the community and bring that awareness. And hopefully after tonight, you'll have conversations with your colleagues at work, your neighbours, your children, your parents, whoever that might be in your circles, to really understand what some of those short-term actions are, really with a focus on electrification. So the other component of work that we're going to do that you might be interested in is how we're going to not only empower our climate champions and also provide those toolkits, but we're going to work on anyone who's interested, and I hope it's most of you, plus more, some series of educational events which will start on the 19th of September about building those networks in our community. And that's really where we're putting our efforts with Marnie and our environment team at council to really get that take-up of understanding how we can actually spread literally word to word, person to person throughout the city, and what that means to actually get to those, I think, really quite stretched targets in the net zero goals we have for Newcastle. And which seems quite simplistic when you spend a couple of hours together here tonight at City Hall, but it is really a huge community effort, and it will have to be undertaken by all of us moving in the same direction. And I really feel like we've done a lot of work in the City of Newcastle in this space, and the best way we can support this transition is to support every single person in the community. So we want you to have that access to, cheap, reliable, renewable energy. And not every house will be able to have solar, and that's why we're going to start working on the exploration of bulk buys for our community, as well as community batteries. And going through that process of exploring what is going to be the best option so everyone can access renewable energy. Just on our next event, and it's just amazing to have Saul come back from the US tonight to be with us. So I just wanted to say a big shout out and a big thank you, and it's so much appreciated, your in-depth knowledge on this topic in so many different facets. I know everyone here would have got as much as me out of it, so thank you again to Saul. In the next couple of months, we have 2 more events before I finish. This is the one that I just told you about. We'll come back here for another event. So this is the deep dive and information session. So if you're interested, if your neighbours are interested, it would be really wonderful to see you back here and do some really detailed work with our community environment team, with Marnie and everyone at council. There's a number of toolkits we can provide you to really, a lot of you are probably really far on this journey yourselves, but we want to make sure this word spreads across Newcastle, and these resources are available for you, and we want to be at that local level of government supporting you on that journey. The other really important event, and I think it's what was interesting for me, and I've been in local government for a long time now, it isn't until in more recent times when we've had the big discussions about offshore wind, and we've had a really different approach from the federal government in the last 2 years to renewable energy, which has really been fantastic. I don't think anyone knew what AEMO was. really, no one knew what AEMO was, and at least now most people that read the paper would have some understanding that there is an energy regulator in this country. And if you don't know what it is, you can't have a conversation to change it. So I think there has been a real shift in the last couple of years about the importance of not just a small-scale renewable, but also large-scale renewable. And importantly, there's been a real shift at a state level. So it's fantastic. We've had Penny Sharp, who's the Minister for Environment and Climate Change, agree to host a net zero forum here next month. And everyone is invited, the same as this event, to really hear where the state government is leading. And they've recently passed net zero legislation. So that's been a huge change at a state level as well. So I really encourage you to register for that event, because they're dealing with the transmission lines, they're also dealing with incentives for industry and workers, as well as the funding for local government to do more EV charges. So there's a really complex piece of work that's happening under Penny Sharp, and she'll be in Newcastle in August to have that direct conversation with us here, which I think is also fantastic, and then obviously the event in September. That's going to wrap us up for this evening. We're probably slightly over time, but just thanks again for all turning out tonight. It's very much appreciated, and a big shout out to Marnie Kicken, your team at Council, and the team we've stood up with Environment and Sustainability. I really hope to see you all again in August and September, if not before.